Welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be exploring the wonderfully diverse world of fungi. My name is Almi Bradfield-van, and I'm a senior occupational hygienist for food safety. Presenting to you today, mold, the health effects and controls. Before we start, the session is being recorded so that if you have to go, no worries. You can come back to our website and you will be able to find what you've missed. Questions will be asked during the question and answer session. But if you do get too excited, you can just pop them into the chat for the questions and answers. We will have a few interactive sessions where I'll ask a few questions. Use the webinar chat just to answer them, or you can use a thumbs up or a thumbs down, depending on what your preference is. Now sit back, relax, and let's delve into the Earth's best decomposers. When we think about fungi, what would be the first thing that comes to mind? Mushrooms or toadstools? These are just the fruiting bodies of fungi, and they are not the only form in which fungi can come in. Yeasts are unicellular fungi, and hyphae is a multicellular structure of fungi. The intact hyphal structures are normally indicative of active growth on microscopic slides, and they are also responsible for producing spores. In the fungal perspective, we look at mushrooms, which is the familiar example of a fruiting body. They are formed from hyphae and contain spores. Hyphae are the tiny threads that make up the bulk of most fungi. A network of hyphae, known as a mycelium, extends in all directions through the soil or substrate of which they feed. Visible mold is only the fruiting body which we observe, as a mycelium is contained in the fibers and cells of the substrate that the fungi is growing on. So in essence, mold is fungi. It's also nature's greatest decomposers. About 25% of the whole of Earth's biomass contains fungi. Fungi is present in the air and settled in dusts, so it's actually everywhere, on the inside and outside. And as you know, many different types of molds exist, about 1.5 million species, yet we only know about 10%. Fungi also doesn't like to grow alone. Sometimes they invite their friends bacteria. So when they start to proliferate in our homes and workplaces, we tend to get ill. And that's due to the fact that any and all molds have the potential to cause ill health effects, as they can produce allergens and mycotoxins. And these can trigger allergic reactions, asthma attacks, immune responses, and others are known to have potent toxins or irritants. The potential health concerns are an important reason to prevent mold growth and to remediate or clean up the existing indoor mold. Let's look at the overview so that we have a better understanding of fungi. Fungi is saprophytes, and that means that they cannot create their own food, so they need dead organic material to eat. They cannot photosynthesize like plants do. They require organic matter, and that is what they use to actually then proliferate and grow. So let's try a question. What material do you think fungi will feed on inside the built environment? I'll give a few minutes just so that everyone can type a response or give the thumbs up or just a guess if you are unsure. All right. So fungi feeds on biodegradable material. In our houses and in our workplaces, biodegradable material includes wood or timber, plasterboard, cardboard, books, clothes, textiles, furnishings, carpets, insulation, wallpaper, glue, and even inside dust if there's enough organic debris. Furniture and houses didn't always get infected as fast as they do nowadays. So what changed? In the past, furniture and houses were made of hardwoods. Hardwoods contain lignins, which are difficult for fungi to digest. But nowadays, and potentially in the future it will be different. But nowadays, manufacturing activities remove most of the lignins from wood products because we chop them and we mold them and we make them into easily digestible cellulose for fungi to feed on. So if we look again at the building, what will fungi not feed on? Again, I'll give a few seconds just for everyone to try and guess up an answer if you're uncertain. All right. Fungi will not feed on inorganic material. This includes masonry, like bricks, concrete, rocks, stone, glass, plastics, ceramics, and metal. However, if there is enough dirt, dust, oil, and grease, and there is organic material contained in that, you will find fungi. And that is also because inorganic materials can act as a water reservoir as well as contain these organic material that fungi can feed on. Because water vapor allows fungi to be able to digest organic debris. So I've given the answer, but let's see if anyone wants to try. Just hold on. Chrissy, can you enable the chat perhaps? There we go. The chat has been enabled. If we can try and guess the third question, or if you know, you're also welcome to put it in. But seems the chat function is not working. All right, so since the Q&A chat function is working, you're welcome to put that in, and we have a few answers already, and that's correct. Fungi needs moisture. And why would fungi need moisture? Well, if we think about dried fruit and how much longer the shelf life is, it should be quite easy to understand that fungi requires the moisture inside of the substrate to be able to actually digest it. And that water or moisture is the water activity inside of a substance that is required for fungi to be able to proliferate. Generally, any water activity that is more than 0.61 will be at risk of fungal infiltration. So if you have substances that has a water activity of less than 0.6, the chances are that only extremophiles will be able to actually get in there. All right, so next question, true or false? Does mold only grow in the dark? Yes, mold does not only grow in the dark. Dark environments mainly harbors moisture due to the fact that there's a lack of sunshine. So that means that there's no radiant heat from the sun. And thus darker areas tend to have more moisture because warm air holds less moisture. Well, actually, warm air holds more moisture because it expands, and cold air gives off moisture. And then that moisture tends to accumulate on top of surfaces, which can then be absorbed into them. So if there's enough moisture in an area where there is also light, the fungi will still proliferate and grow. Just a quick question. Can everyone still see the slideshow? All right, perfect. Then we'll continue. So when we think about getting rid of fungi, what are the sort of things that comes to mind? I'm seeing in the chat that we have a few experts here. Let's just go back. So the items listed on the screen is generally what comes to mind with most of the population who is quite unaware of fungi and the dangers that can actually be coincided with using biocides, vinegar, bleach, tea tree oil, chlorinated isocyanates, hydrogen peroxide, and fogging activities. Biocides are commercial products that tend to be advertised to use and control the spread of harmful organisms by biological or chemical means, which are commonly called biocides. Biocides are actually a very broad term that is used to include disinfectants, preservatives, antiseptics, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, and pesticides. So let's run through another question. True or false? Bleach kills all fungi. All right, the majority is correct. Bleach does not kill all fungi. Some fungi will actually grow on bleach and other biocides. However, bleach can cause fungi to lose their color, which would make them invisible. And the fungi can also actually use the liquid contained inside of biocides, which creates favorable conditions to grow. So, when the bleach removes the melanin from the fungal structures, it may seem like it's killed it, but it's just transparent. Fungicides specific to types of fungi does not mean that they kill all of them, but could have an effect on one or two specific species. However, biocides are effective in killing bacteria, which, as we know, are friends of fungi and are sometimes in the area where you will find them. So if you do find bacteria contaminated with your fungal species in an area which you would like to clean, you can use the bleach to kill the bacteria. So apart from fungal risks, bleach and other biocides can also result in the formation of chloramines, cause eye and respiratory irritation, cause skin damage and burns, and there's also a risk when you are mixing bleach and ammonia or other cleaning products, which will then have a reaction on their own and create toxic fumes. So what will we do about fungi then, if we cannot just bleach them or throw a chemical at them? Well, it's important to know the signs and symptoms of fungal infiltration. We can take steps to prevent favorable conditions, ensure building maintenance is done on a routine basis, ensure HVAC systems are properly maintained on a routine basis, prevent clutter from obstructing airflow, regulate cleaning to prevent dust and dirt buildup, as well as using vacuum-filtered HEPA filters, as some of you already know from what I've seen in the answers. So why do we use a HEPA filter? Well, as you can see on the screen, Mold spores are actually quite small, and a general vacuum cleaner that's either not fitted with a filter, because people forget, or fitted with just the general filter bags that are not actually HEPA. Pet dander and pollen might be caught, but dust, mold spores, smoke, bacteria, and viruses are actually going through all of those filters if it's not a HEPA. How do we know when fungi has actually infiltrated in our homes if we don't, for example, see it with the visible eye? We smell them, and we smell them because they give off microvolatile organic compounds, or MVOCs. They also contain protein and mycotoxins produced only by certain forms of fungi, but also by gram-negative bacteria. So in essence, you can say that moldy odors are indicators of dampness inside buildings. And these damp, musty odors are characteristic of water-damaged buildings. In the absence of visible mold, if you smell them, it's likely that they're hiding. Typically, these odors can be described as musty, stale, damp, earthy, sour, rotting, fermenting, or even tangy, or a combination of all. Visual cues are also helpful if you've smelled them, or even if you didn't smell them. Discoloration of surfaces and materials could be an identification that there has been water damage. Visible water on damaged surfaces, or visible water damage on surfaces. Also, if there is condensation happening in the house, you will see visible water on the surfaces or even on your doors and windows. If there's staining from this water damage, it'll follow an erratic pattern, which means that it won't be straight lines or smooth, perfect corners. You'll find blistering or peeling paint, fuzzy appearances on smooth finishings. Even pests really likes it when there's been water damage because it makes it easier for them to get into the wood or into the surfaces and into the materials. So a tendency for termites, wood borers, cockroaches, and spiders to actually get into those areas and live in those environments could be a good indication that something's off. If surfaces are brittle or soft, it indicates a structural change, which could have been from water damage. Spills or floods, if you've let the bath overflow, or if you've spilled a glass of water, dry it up and try and get it dry within 48 hours, because after 48 hours, mold would likely try to infiltrate. Also, when it's raining, have a look outside and see if there's any water pooling close to the house, or if there's any leaking from gutters into your roof spaces. These are good indications of where water damage are likely to get. So, signs of fungal infiltration in terms of health effects. Health effects tend to be specific to the location of where you are being exposed. So if the symptoms are presenting in one area and you leave that area and a few hours later you start to feel fine, it's most likely that you've been exposed at a specific location. Another reason for health effects is that people tend to be allergic to mold and fungi because of the proteins within their structures. So you start to get allergic reactions. These can include eczema on your skin, conjunctivitis in your eyes, rhinitis of the nose, asthma, and even low blood pressure. You could also have symptoms that could include frequent respiratory infections, or you can go into mycotoxicosis. We'll have a chat about that later. There's also the fact that fungi causes inflammation, which in the human body tends to happen that you start feeling fatigue, you get brain fog, you get extremely irritable, and some people even tend to get a little bit irrational. So let's look at the mycotoxins. We're not going to go through all of them. There's simply not enough time in one webinar, but we can have a talk about the most deadly ones, the most dangerous ones, and we'll start with Aspergillus fungal that creates the toxin aflatoxin. So aflatoxin B1 is also not the only aflatoxin that exists. But for today's purposes, we'll look at B1. B1 causes genotoxic, immunotoxic, hepatotoxic, mutagenic reactions. And this aflatoxin is also considered to be the most abundant, most toxic, and most potent of the naturally occurring carcinogenic substances known. And it's also the leading cause of liver cancer in many developing countries. Aflatoxins are not only produced by Aspergillus, it's also produced by various species of penicillin, Rhizopus, Mucor, and Streptomyces. If we look at ochratoxin, the example we're going to use today, and one of the most potent, is ochratoxin A. This toxin is nephrotoxic, genotoxic, immunotoxic, and neurotoxic. It's also a carcinogen for animals and a class 2B for humans, which means it's potentially carcinogenic. And ochratoxin A has also been associated with human kidney disease. But penicillin is not the only fungus which can produce this toxin. Aspergillus, Petromyces, and Neopetromyces can also produce this. Stachybotrys, producing trichothecenes. These cause the inhibition of protein synthesis, which causes multi-organ effects, including emesis and diarrhea, weight loss, nervous disorder, cardiovascular alterations, immunodepression, hemostatic derangements, skin toxicity, decreased reproductive capacity, and bone marrow damage. Stachybotrys, however, is also not the only fungi that can produce this toxin. Fusarium and Myrothecium can also produce trichothecenes. This also includes the T2 toxin and deoxynivalenol. These toxins are extremely toxic and have been used as biological warfare agents and have been demonstrated to cause neurological system damage from water-damaged buildings. Now we all know why it's important when there's a high level of fungal contamination that we get a professional to identify which fungi is present and how to remove them and their fungal particulate. So what do? We look at external moisture management. Ensure there's proper drainage of runoff water away from the building at roof level and at ground level. We make sure we check our gutters and downpipes regularly, that we get them cleaned and check that they are free from blockages and remove the leaf litter. We make sure that our water membranes inside of our buildings are within their service life. And if they are outside of their service life, we need to get that fixed. Ensure that garden beds and foliage does not obstruct building ventilation, especially within your subfloors or lower levels. And where a building is built into a hilly area, any of those areas that are next to the soil needs to also be mechanically ventilated. When we look at internal moisture control, we need to make use of extraction ventilation systems, especially in the kitchen and bathroom areas and the laundry. So range hoods, extraction fans in the bathroom, and ducted tumble dryers becomes essential. And we need to ensure that these extraction units extract to the outside, not through the insulation in the roof, and also not just into the roof void if the roof void is not ventilated. We also need to be certain that we're not hanging clothes inside of a poorly ventilated area. So if we hang clothes, we need to make sure that the area is good and dry and warm, and that there is sufficient ventilation to remove the additional moisture that we're putting into that area. If there's spillages or accidents, we need to clean them and dry them within 48 hours and prevent clutter so that there is sufficient air movement within our indoor areas. We also need to consider condensation. And what I mean by that is the effect that temperature and air movement have on water droplets forming on surfaces. So even when we're not at home, we are on holiday, or we go away, or we leave the office, we need to ensure that our indoor temperatures are kept above 15 degrees Celsius, even when no one is around. And the reason for that is when it's cold outside and we don't have proper insulation, the indoor areas cools down. If it goes below 15 degrees, we start running the risk of all of the moisture inside of the air to be thrown off and start to accumulate on surfaces, on walls, on carpets, and that moisture tends to get absorbed into the material, which could then lead to fungal growth. Double glazing are also favored over single glazing where possible, but if that is not an option, good wall panel heaters could be placed close to windows so that you can heat this area and prevent condensation. HVAC systems should also be inspected because they are not immune from fungal infiltration. They also need to provide proper humidification and dehumidification. We also need to make sure that the water drainage of HVAC systems are not blocked or are not throwing water down a wall cavity. And what's also important is that the HVAC system needs to be balanced to prevent any water buildup within the insulation of the ducting. So what do we do when we do find fungi? If the contamination is smaller than an A4 piece of paper, and we know that it is not of a harmful type, it's growing on porous hard surfaces, such as linoleum, ceramic, tiles, and vinyl, we can use a HEPA vacuum and damp wipe with warm water and mild detergent, and when necessary, even scrub. When we've cleaned, we need to make sure that the area that we've cleaned is dried within 48 hours. And we also need to make sure that where we've wetted an area, that if, for example, it's vinyl, that the water hasn't seeped in underneath it. If the contamination is on non-porous hard surfaces, such as glass, plastic, and metals, we can still use a HEPA vacuum and damp wipe it with warm water and mild detergent and scrub it if necessary. Also, just ensure that it dries within 48 hours so that there's no moisture running down these surfaces onto other material. If the contamination is larger than an A4 piece of paper, or there's multiple A4 pieces of paper, it's porous and semi-porous material, such as textiles, carpet, bedding, curtains, softwood or timber, spongy or woody insulation material, contact a professional. Have them do a mold assessment, figure out what you're dealing with. They are also trained to provide isolation of the areas that are infected in order to protect family members as well as yourself from getting exposed to all of the mycotoxins and fungal particulates. This also prevents fungal spread from one area to another. So if you're not trained to do so, don't attempt to remove or remediate mold-contaminated materials. Exposure to spores, fungal fragments, and other small particles such as non-organic debris could be potential carriers of aerosolized mycotoxins and therefore be a cause for concern. Bacterial cell walls include endotoxins, and fungal cell walls include hyphae and spores, which could contain beta-delta glucans, and sometimes even mycotoxins. This means that even if actual fungal growth was removed, people can still get sick from the fungal particulate left behind and built up on surfaces. And this is why it's important to know how far the fungal particulate has spread between areas so that the mycotoxins and fungal spores are not left behind and cleaned up. If you plan on using air purifiers, it's also important to note that the HEPA filters fitted with inside them needs to be cleaned out and exchanged with new HEPA filters routinely. And the frequency of doing that also is determined by the amount of particulate load that this air purifier needs to service. The same goes with HEPA filtered vacuum cleaners. The HEPA filter does not have an indefinite life cycle. It also needs to be exchanged with a new filter. Filters can also not just be cleaned or cleaned out by bumping it, because that will just put all of the particulate matter back into the air. So it's important that you throw that away and get a new one. All right, we've come to our question and answer session. If there's any questions from what we just discussed, feel free to drop it into the Q&A box. While we're waiting for some of these questions to come in, let's have a chat about air purifiers and more specifically, the dangers that people are not aware of with regards to ionizing air purifiers. An ionizing air purifier works through ionizing the air. So what it does is it pushes out a lot of charged particles into the surrounding environment. These particles then react with the molecules of air, oxygen, nitrogen, and even water vapor. And this reaction also then creates ozone, which is not great for human health or the environment. And the charged particles also causes particulates to drop from the air and stick to surfaces. And that means that children and pets are at high exposure risk. Right, so Nikki has sent us a question asking if you can encapsulate mold by painting over it. Well, the short answer is if you haven't removed the water from the substance that the mold is growing on and you paint over it, it's just going to create blistering and the mold is still going to continue growing. Do ozone generators kill bacteria? The dangers with ozone actually is so high that if you're not a trained professional, you shouldn't really try to be killing bacteria with ozone. As we know, bacteria can be killed with biocides, so it would be better to go and kill the bacteria with something less harmful than ozone. What companies can you use for mold assessments or for remediation and removal? There would be links at the end of the webinar on the website that you can find mold assessors and remediators. If you are trained in using ozone and there is really no other option, I would still not advise using ozone, as it is not a very effective way of treating bacteria or mold. So how can you safely remove mold from soft surfaces such as curtains? That really does depend on how much of the curtain has been infiltrated. If it is a large section, if it's starting to get more than an A4 size, you would be better off just removing the curtains and unfortunately getting new ones. HRV systems could be a helpful way of getting more ventilation into the building environment. However, not all HRV systems actually warm the indoor air. So it'll be dependent on whether your system is balanced, on whether or not the system can actually effectively remove all of the water vapor that is being built up within your area. And that all depends on how you are drying your clothes, how the cooking systems are running. So it could be a helpful tool, but on its own, it tends to not always be very effective. The reference guides and helpful guides for approved code of practices for mold assessments and remediations do exist. However, you need to also be trained in them and be registered with the IRCRC. But we will have links to all of those registered informational topics with the webinar information that comes through on the website. All right, if there's no further questions, we have come to the end of the webinar. Thank you for your time and take care.